sees his own likeness and says, obviously, here I am. This is considered to be direct thinking. But the only reason he is able to say, here I am, is that a series of sensory testimonies have been carried to the brain. Cut these testimonies off so that the individual is aware neither of the mirror nor of himself. And he cannot arrive at this conclusion any more than a person born totally blind can ever arrive at true color consciousness. It is only because of the faculties we possess and their use according to the laws governing these faculties themselves that we are able to come to certain definite conclusions about our own existence, the existence of other things, the past from which we came, the present in which we now live, and the future which we hope for. These things all exist because of the continuous cyclic interplay of sensation and rationalization through mental alchemy. If this be more or less reasonable, and there is much evidence to sustain it, particularly in the field of abnormal psychology, man remains today what he has always been, a being who does not know himself, who has no way of actually becoming aware of his own true nature. Because it is obvious that this true nature cannot be fully comprehended on the basis of the sensory cycle. Man cannot experience the invisible part of himself. He does not know how. It will not be discernible to any sensory perception. And for lack of this ability to capture it within the net of the five senses, the individual cannot know about it. Therefore, what we term speculation on these subjects is merely the pressing of the familiar along back toward the unfamiliar. It is the imposing of the world of senses upon the unseen universe that cannot be comprehended. Therefore, we merely project our physical thinking into space and call it metaphysics. This is what it essentially amounts to. It is our own pattern that simply seeks for solution by the rarefication of its own accepted processes. We see this in the study of all primitive culture, where God emerges as king, merely the extension of the tribal chieftain. Always deity is the hero or the chieftain or the patriarch we have known plus. And this plus is achieved in our heart by putting a halo around his head. It's the best we can do with it. But when we put the halo around his head, we tell everyone the explanation of the halo, and it becomes a word. And this word says, I am not human. I am superior to that which is human. Thus we put wings on angels, not because we've ever seen any with real feathers, but because we wish it to be known that we are not dealing with literal human beings, and not knowing how to draw an angel in proper person. We draw the most attractive human being that we can, and then make it an angel by the adding of wings, much as the Mayas made a verb out of a noun by also adding a wing to signify energy. So we are pushing these sensory conclusions backward, and we are trying continuously to penetrate the unknown by the brute force and awkwardness of sensory intensity. But we are brought for the reason that the mental coordinator cannot coordinate that which the senses do not bring in. The mental coordinator has no existence apart from the process of coordination itself. So we experience it because we use it. If it was not used, it would vanish from our awareness and we would not know that it exists. Thus we have now the brain, and we recognize the tremendous mystery of this structure. We realize that in many respects it is one of our most valuable possessions. It is an instrument created almost like a television or a radio, by means of which we can tune in the processes of mental energy by which man is able to solemnly and seriously declare that he is a thinking being. This thinking being the executive leadership of the mind over the testimonies of the sensory perceptions. Facts, therefore, as we think of them scientifically, are bound very closely to sensory perceptions. The scientist doubts that which the physical faculties cannot sustain, and as far as he can go, he uses them. Where he cannot use these, he uses the scientific processes of mathematics to substitute symbols for facts and to call upon the highest available resources of the mental coordinator. If this thinking has some value in principle, and it seems to come the nearest to any solution that we know, we can then say, what is the pure nature of mind itself, as separated from brain? If the individual is to step out of the brain, what happens to him? The first thing that must inevitably happen, of course, is that any form of sensation dependent upon the brain and the nervous system must be blocked or cut off. The individual is no longer, therefore, able to experience this mysterious cycle of the Dharma chakra. He is no longer able to defend his sensations with his mental coordinator or express his mental coordination through his sensory functions. Thus he becomes, so to say, separated from a sphere of activity in which the brain is the one and only link. Consequently, the phenomenal universe, as he knows it, must cease to exist. Aye, but there's one other factor. And that other factor is that among the mental coordinating factors that have been brought out by this process through evolution is a power of retention. Therefore, it is true likewise that the individual is continually building a mental image. Without this mental image, the value of sensation and reflex would be comparatively nil. The individual would have the perfect capacity to make the same mistake 1,000,000 times and never even know that he did it. It is only by use of the retentive faculty that thoughts remind us of previous experiences, or previous experiences are retained to become, in a sense, censors over new testimony. This procedure then tells one other thing, that if the sensory area is blocked by the loss of the body, by brain disease, or by any other circumstance which renders the brain function impossible, then the mind still has a mental existence of its own, an existence in an area of things remembered, an internal existence Now, as far as that is concerned, would such an internal existence be any different as far as the mental pattern is concerned than it would be if we still had the brain and the sensory function here? Actually, the world around us does not enter into us. The world around us simply becomes the basis of these experiences, which, carried along the lines of the sensory perceptions, become organized in the mind into images, ideas, and patterns. Consequently, the power of the mind to image is not destroyed by the loss of the body. The only thing that is lost is the power to receive continual physical stimulus, which might rapidly or dramatically change or modify the brain's imagery. Buddhists make a great point of this in connection with the after-death state and in the use of their great religious ritual of the bardo, the equivalent of the Egyptian ritual of the dead. The concept here being that the mind can retain the imagery of its own processes and will retain the estate which it has achieved by the interpretation of sensory phenomena, and that this will continue and will survive and will ultimately be capable of informing a new body, so that the individual's mental life can be transferred from one form to another. And being so transferred, it retains that degree of judgment or coordination which it has previously attained. And when the new brain is available, it simply continues to receive further stimuli and to coordinate these in terms of its own attainment, until finally the brain theoretically can attain to the full possession of this mental process, so that in certain persons of apparently great wisdom, the brain seems to be superior to that of the average individual. Actually, however, the evolution of brain process is merely a shadow of the evolution of mental integration. It is the mind that ensouls the brain that is the growing structure. The brain only can achieve a continuing refinement of organic quality so that the mind may function more accurately through it and receive information more completely and rapidly from the sensory reflexes. This ends in what many Eastern philosophies have believed, in the peculiar blind end of the mind gradually gaining an estate of itself, so that there is a kind of immortality conferred by mentation, and that the mind theoretically as an entity can go on growing, experiencing through a sequence of brains which it inhabits, until finally the mental being attains a very high degree of refinement, a very high degree of skill in estimating phenomena. But all the way through, even in its most reflective moods, the mind still retains its essential problem, that of dependency upon sensation for the stimulation of its resources. Now, how then can we identify or separate mind from mental brain phenomena? How are we to discover the nature of mind as it is? This was one of the reasons for the development of the theory of contemplative or meditative discipline. It was the belief of ancient peoples that the mental entity could best be experienced in its own nature by the gradual reduction of the influence or pressure of brain sensation stimulation. Thus, in quietude, in the gradual attainment of discrimination, in the reduction of the intensity of sensory existence, it became evident that less and less phenomena would be communicated to the mental entity. Theoretically, if the mental entity during life reaches a certain degree of relaxation in which it is no longer forced to interpret phenomena, the individual, the mystic, has come to the conclusion that it is possible then that he might be able to experience the laws of mind, whereas now he can experience only the laws of brain. If the mind has an existence apart from the body, then it has an existence of itself, which is not to be merely the shadowed reflection of physical circumstances. And the mind, having its own mental life, can produce a kind of mentation in which the laws of mind, the laws of the mental state of knowing, which are best expressed in the concept of reason or the concept of true judgment or the concept of abstract creative mentation. These processes come to the individual who is able to break the continual tyranny of sensation, which, bombarding the mental equipment all the time, forbids the mind to express its own nature, but permits it only to express the reflex of our own purposes. As this procedure goes along, the mystic holds very strongly to the conviction that the mind processes, as they relax and become unconditioned by environment pressure, begin to develop these capacities which we associate with the mystical experience or some higher divine state of being. Beyond the mind remains the unsolved mystery of consciousness itself. The brain is personal. The mind is individual. Consciousness is universal. And the bridge between mind as universal and consciousness is as yet extremely dim to us, although it seems that at certain times a flash of pure consciousness does become available. More likely, however, it is still conditioned, but being better than we have previously had, seems as though it is pure divinity itself. Consciousness in Eastern philosophy is the exact opposite of consciousness as we know it objectively. Therefore, in terms of the experience sensation processes of brain and mind, true consciousness is conceived of only as a vacuum, only as that which is not mentation, that which is not brain or sensation reflex. If we want to study this matter further, we can gain a great deal of consolation, as I have noted in the book, from the study of various parallel systems of world religion and philosophy. The world has always recognized that in some way the brain had to do with the great processes of manifestation. The great triad in the body of man, corresponding to the three persons of the Godhead, was the heart, the brain, and the reproductive system. These represented the three great life centers, without which the function of the human being would be impossible. It was the opinion of the ancients that what we term now as energy or pure life has its polarization in the human heart, and that from this polarization the energy is communicated to the brain by which it is activated. Therefore, that the source, the dynamo, the reservoir of energy in man is brought in and manifested through the heart center. That this in turn is then distributed throughout the body, and a specialized aspect of it becomes polarized in the brain, and the other, or negative aspect, becomes polarized in the reproduction of the species. This balance of energy would then cause us to assume that if we could go deeper than the brain in search of a center for consciousness, that we would turn and must turn to the heart. That the heart, therefore, lies behind the manifestation of energy which we know as brain mental energy. If, therefore, a superior nature possesses the brain with its mind, it possesses the heart with its consciousness. And the heart is to the consciousness what the brain is to the mind. This consciousness the ancients called spirit, and they therefore assumed that the spirit had its abode in the heart, the soul, which included the entire psychic nature, in the brain, and the energy or vitality in the great generative complex of nerves. In this way, a triad was established, and we can then continue, perhaps even with the thought from the Bible, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. That behind mind is this heart complex, through which the consciousness of a being manifests and becomes the total possessor of body, and as the complete autocrat, then permits the polarization of its own purpose in the brain as the mental focus. Now, it is reasonably obvious that during the processes of life, the brain is active. That this activity has what we have suggested as this kind of round-robin process. This process of the wheel turning. And then we come to the problem of how the mind is associated with the brain. Does the mind impose itself completely on the brain? Does the mind envelop the brain? Does the mind hide itself in certain cells of the brain? Is the mind lurking in the mysterious ventricular openings of the brain? This was the more common thought of the ancient. He held definitely that the most attenuated part of the brain must be the part which links it to the next superior and still more attenuated energy. Therefore, that in all probabilities there might be within the brain itself no cell, no physical unit, which could be appropriately used as a pole for the mental principle. If, therefore, there is any, the ancients made a rather subtle use of the old story of the tabernacle in the wilderness, in which they divided the wanderers' temple of the Jewish tribes in the wilderness into its three parts: the court, the holy place, and the holy of holies, declaring these three parts to represent, in a sense, the parts of man's body. That within the body itself, within the area of the body, there were two principal rooms. the holy place, which was the body as an instrument, and the Holy of Holies, which was the cranium, or the skull. And that this was, as the Greeks said, attached to the body by an isthmus called the neck. I think that's a rather nice way of saying it. An isthmus. We all know how it would sound if someone said, well, I have a pain in the isthmus. This, it might also be a good way of putting a certain well-known phrase in case you are having social difficulties. In any event, within the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant consisted of these two cherubs kneeling upon the surface of a great chest-like box. The cherubs faced each other, and their wings met overhead. And the space beneath their wings was called the mercy seat. And it was here, between the wings of the cherubs, that the Shekinah's glory, or the presence of the Lord, was made manifest. The Shekinah's glory did not appear in the box, nor did it take over either of the cherubs, nor did it have an image of its own, for no image was permitted of it. It appeared in a space between these cherubs, whose meeting wings above resembled very closely the structure of the two hemispheres of the forebrain. Within this space, inside the brain, overshadowed by these two great brain lobes, is a series of ventricles, of which perhaps the most commonly referred to and best known is the third ventricle. It is in this ventricular space also that we find the location of the two great ductless glands of the brain, the pineal and the pituitary body. In the ancient beliefs, Albertus Magnus held this opinion, so did the great artist Leonardo da Vinci. It was the common belief of the great Arab physicians and scholars of older time that in some mysterious way this ventricular opening, this hollow place, this room, this secret abode of the Most High, this wonderful palace built upon the Palatine Hill, the palate being the upper part of the mouth, that here we have the place where the superior principle, in this case the mental principle, has its closest possible relationship with the body. Now, in order for this relationship to exist, it is inevitable and necessary, therefore, that this ventricular space be not empty, but rather be in a continual state of vibration, that a golden mist, or as was sometimes referred to in the old writings, a kind of dew of heaven, that this actually had to fill this ventricle, and that in this mysterious glow or light, the Shekinah's glory, which in all probabilities is the original of the halo around the head, that in this light field, the next superior part impinged itself upon the brain, and that in this way it was continually exercising a very subtle influence. And into this area, according to the older beliefs, the sensations poured, and in this area they were coordinated. Leonardo da Vinci, in one of his wonderful drawings of the cross-section of the human brain, he anticipated Vesalius slightly, but did not carry the point as far as this great anatomist. In one of his drawings, following earlier custom, of course, Leonardo labels the central ventricular orifice of the brain the place of the community of the senses. He calls this, of course, where the senses are in common. And, of course, we preserve the term by saying common sense. That this is the field of the common sense in man. Well, now we all realize the field is in a sad state of decrepitude at the present moment, but that perhaps something could be done to reclaim it. The common sense in this case does not mean judgment that agrees with the masses. Common sense means a place where these various processes meet in some common ground, a coordinating area. And Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas were both of the opinion that it was in this central area, this central ventricular space, that all confusion and discord concerning sensory perception had to be arbitrated, and that out of this arbitration came reasonable opinion, or attitudes that were themselves common sense, or arising from the common testimony of all senses. Now, if we use that definition today, who would claim common sense? Who could say common sense if it meant that it was a common and honest union of the testimony of all senses, opinions, attitudes, beliefs, and desires? That therefore common sense was as near as we can attain to the truth of the matter, because all of the elements of the matter have been honestly estimated and fitted together into their most reasonable pattern. This automatic process is said to go on continuously. But with the possibility of the mental impingement being therefore in the field of this energy, we can say, what kind of energy are we now dealing with? The answer most likely is the field of the nervous energy of the body. For it is into this as into a reservoir that must pour all of the sensations which have been gathered by the nervous system, specialized and put back into semblance of reasonable appearance or reasonable coordination by the brain structure itself, and then dispatched to this central region for interpretation, for classification, and for judgment upon the matter. The brain does not judge. The brain turns it all over to the mysterious oracle that abides in the shadow of the Most High. And therefore, as the priest of the ancient tabernacle rites entered into the Holy of Holies to there ask the will of God in all matters, so we may say that the brain, to achieve the interpretation of sensory testimony which it has assembled, must for this purpose call upon a power superior to itself. And this superior to itself power is present because of the impingement of the mental nature upon this sensitized area, which is a highly specialized electromagnetic field within the brain. If this is assumed out of ancient symbolism to be not an unreasonable conclusion, we may then suspect that there is a reason for the very subtle membrane which is curiously placed in this area, a membrane which could have a function of almost a God ear. Just as the eardrum is responsive to certain vibration, so this mysterious curtain in the third ventricle could very well be the mysterious drum the mysterious, subtle substance by means of which the vibration agitation could be set up. Therefore, that the actual communication is in terms of vibration made possible through the very rapid motion of this drum-like membrane in the field of energy. We are not able to dogmatize these things because science simply has not been able to explore this matter. But it would follow immediately that if this field is composed of this rarefied form of energy distilled from the nerve processes of the body, and therefore carrying in it, as in the air a radio program is carried, the various testimonies set up by sensory perception, it would then, of course, immediately follow that if for any reason this magnetic field of body energy is cut off, that immediately the available energy in this glandular field or in this ventricular field would also be cut off. Under such conditions, this field would suddenly become negative. It would simply no longer be a field of energy. It would become a vacuum. This would immediately cut off the possibility of the mind operating upon these energies, and the mind's relationship to the body and to brain function would be lost. Also, it is quite obvious that at death, all such energy fields would cease as far as the body is concerned. Consequently, the moment these energies ceased, there could no longer be a rational connection between the mind and the brain field. The mind would not necessarily have to depart anywhere, any more than it would be necessary for the broadcasting station to